Welcome everyone to part 2 of making biblical correlations that ring true. And isn't that what it's all about? His word is like a big tapestry, woven tapestry, and we find these threads throughout his word and that connect all the dots of various topics. It's very, very exciting. And this week's title is The Agitation and Manifestation of Demonic Spirits. So today we will be viewing 2 short videos by BlkShp Bible Talk with Scott. I mean, it's obvious you can tell that this has been an insight and a passion that was given to him. It seems to be his very purpose as part of the body in articulating these things about the spiritual realm involving Leviathan all the way to demonic spirits. So we're going to listen to one of his video clips titled Leviathan. And we know the term Leviathan is mentioned in the book of Job. So hopefully we can slow things down to absorb several key points and be good Bereans. The Leviathan clip was referenced at the very end of last week's video. So I wanted to incorporate it in today's teaching. And if you recall, we discussed the terms Tehom, the deep, and Tohu, the desert, the wilderness. In the Leviathan teaching, we will look more deeply in how Yahusha's treading on water was the ultimate sign of victory over the deep, the Tehom. And we know in Revelation 12 and 21, we see the final extraction recorded of the dragon and the permanent end of the sea of chaos. Then later today, in this session, we're going to look at the teaching he gives on demonic spirits and see those biblical correlations about demons that ring true. The branch. We know Yahusha is known as the branch, Jesus of Nazareth. He is the way, the truth, and the life. He is the total opposite of the adversary. So we're going to see the appearance of the branch in his first coming, obviously agitated and manifested demonic spirits. We know truth dispels darkness, but it can also agitate and manifest those demonic spirits around us, or those demonic spirits working through the flesh of man. Just ask Stephen in Acts chapter 7 as he stood before the council of the Sanhedrin. They became so agitated that they gnashed their teeth. They manifested the demonic spirits influencing their flesh. So much so that they later what? They take up stones to shut him up. I have a short video clip we're going to watch right now of what essentially takes place when the branch, or when royal ambassadors encounter a territorial pocket of chaos and the subsequent agitation afterwards. It is much like an ant mound being disturbed.
Anthill. What do you think is going to happen when I poke it with the stick?
That's for sure. That's for sure. The appearance of the stone kingdom with his second coming will also agitate and manifest demonic spirits. So, likewise, with Yahusha's second coming, his word has prepared us for a time of great tribulation, great agitation, great cosmic chaos, when his stone kingdom will crush the feet and 10 toes of the statue, and chaos will break forth. But no, during this time, his people are sealed. We read about that in Revelation 9:1 through 9:11. It says, "And the fifth messenger sounded, and I saw a star from the heaven, which had fallen to the earth, and the key to the pit of the deep was given to him. And he opened the pit of the deep, and smoke went up out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun was darkened, also the air, because of the smoke of the pit. And out of the smoke locusts came upon the earth, and authority was given to them as the scorpions of the earth possess authority. And it was said to them that they shall not harm the grass of the earth, or any green matter, or any tree, but only those men who do not have the seal of Elohim upon their foreheads. And it was given to them that they should not kill them, but to torture them for 5 months. And their torture was like the torture of a scorpion when it stings a man. And in those days, men shall seek death and shall not find it." I mean, that is suffering, is it not? "And they shall long to die, but death shall flee from them. And the locusts looked like horses prepared for battle, and on their heads were crowns like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. And they had hair like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots of many horses running into battle. And they have tails like scorpions and stings, and in their tails is their authority to harm men 5 months. And they have over them a sovereign, the messenger of the pit of the deep, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, but in Greek he has the name Apollyon." So, in many ways, it seems to be describing possibly modern day drones. I mean, they even make drones that look like flying insects and creatures. In Job 16:16, we read, "See, I am sending for many fishermen, declares Yahweh, and they shall fish them." And we are in the days of the fishermen, are we not? Are we not fishing for men, fishing and trying to share the gospel message and save souls? But it goes on to say, "And after that, I shall send for many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and every hill, and out of the holes of the rocks." In part one of Making Biblical Correlations That Ring True, we discussed the meaning of Tehom, deep, and Tohu, desert. We discovered that in the biblical imagination, Tehom, the deep or the sea, is never a neutral place. It's the place where chaos lives, where Leviathan coils, where the forces that oppose Yahweh's ordered creation press against the boundaries he set for them. There is an agitation or perturbation when boundaries are crossed. Every time you see the sea in the Hebrew scriptures doing something dramatic, you're watching the ancient chaos push against its limits. Then we look to the east, on the other side of the promised land, past the Jordan River to Tahu, the Arabian desert. And that desert has its own word in the Hebrew imagination. That word is the same word used in Genesis 1:2 for formless, the wilderness. You could say it's the wasteland, the dry, empty, uncreated space where nothing ordered can survive for long. We saw what lay between these two regions of chaos was the land in biblical cosmology. We must not forget that the adversary of chaos thrives in a bloodthirsty state that wars for the souls of mankind. Satan rules over all principalities and powers, spirits of wickedness, and rulers of darkness that at times manifest in our physical realm through the flesh of man, oftentimes. His goal is to kill, steal, fracture, or destroy. His arsenal is the knowledge of the tree of good and evil. Yeah, he always mixes it together. It is a mixture, a deadly potion, combining truth and lies that can cause stumbling to the point of death. And we know his word tells us you will recognize them by their fruit. In order to survive Leviathan or Behemoth, one must be sealed by Yahweh, be washed by the blood of the Lamb. And keep in mind, we fight from victory in Yahusha with his triumph over sin and death. Would we be so foolish to come against such evil without him? Of course not. We have reaped that wisdom from the book of Job. Now, let's look more deeply at the Leviathan figure in this video clip by BlkShp Bible Talk with Scott. I mean, this is definitely his calling, his purpose, and we can glean so much from our brothers and sisters that have a special focus, especially sometimes on such topics as these, that these topics themselves need to be rightly divided, or we get off track and we get confused. So here we go.
Was Leviathan real? Is Leviathan alive today? When I did a quick study of YouTube talking about this topic, I found a lot of videos, but no satisfying answers.
According to the Old Testament, there is a giant creature in the ocean's depths. His name is Leviathan.
There is waters, okay, all over. Now, the Bible says this is what's going to happen. That way you can tell.
Many have even believed it to represent a dinosaur, but that idea has long been debunked.
Life finds a way.
So I decided to answer it myself. It's the kind of question that usually gets buried in the fringe section of the library, right between cryptozoology and ancient aliens. Some of my favorite YouTubers have talked about this realness of Leviathan. Channels like Blurry Creatures and Ninjas Are Butterflies are never afraid to swim in the deep end with this sea monster. By the way, if you know those guys, tell them to email me. I want to talk to them. If you grew up in a typical Sunday school class on the weekends, you were probably handed a brochure with a drawing of a plesiosaur or a particularly grumpy crocodile. The naturalists want to turn him into a biology project, just study his natural form. The academics want to treat him like a character from literature, a myth borrowed from the ancient neighbors to spice up a desert poem. For them, he's just a metaphor. But they're missing something. They're missing a lot, actually. When you look at the primary sources of the ancient Near East, the clay tablets and the inscriptions of the Bronze Age, and even the scriptures itself, you realize that zoology wasn't top of mind for the biblical authors. It wasn't their highest priority. They didn't really concern themselves too much with it at all. They were using a well-known creature at the time to document a very real and universal conflict. They were recording the historical movements of an ancient, non-human adversary that existed before the earth was even habitable. For our purposes today, Leviathan isn't a creature you find in a swamp. He's a primary antagonist in a high-stakes power struggle. He's a leader of a cosmic rebellion. I'll get back to the creature in the swamp at the end of this video, But first, I think we need to establish that there's a much greater concern than a large reptile. Think of it like this. If the story of Scripture is the story of an architect building a global household, a family, then Leviathan is like the hostile squatter. He's the active breathing chaos in opposition to the order of the king. He's the shadow in the corner of the room that refuses to be lit. With Leviathan, we've usually been told to look for bones in the dirt, big bones, of course, but we really should have been looking for fingerprints of a dragon in the headlines of history. Because you don't build a meta-narrative this large on a myth, you build it on something very real. Today, I'm opening the dossier on the most dangerous operative in the biblical record. It's going to take us to the geography of the wilderness, the crushing pressure of the deep abyss of the oceans, and the reason why God lets chaos reign in this world from time to time. To understand the Leviathan of Scripture, it's a good idea to start in 1895 AD, just over a century ago. That's when a German scholar named Hermann Gunkel published a work called Creation and Chaos. Gunkel was doing forensic work on the biblical text, and he noticed something. He saw that the Hebrew writers weren't just describing a pretty sunset in Genesis chapter 1. They were using a very specific technical language that appeared all over the ancient Near East. He called it the Chaos Kampf, or the struggle against chaos. Whether you were in Babylon reading about Marduk and Tiamat, or in Ugarit reading about Baal and the serpent Lotan, the story was the same. A hero god fighting a multi-headed monster from the deep to bring order to the world. It even had the same version in Egypt with Ra defeating Apep or Apophis. But Gunkel realized the Bible wasn't just copy-pasting these myths. It was subverting them. He was writing a polemic. It was documenting the actual insurgency that those other cultures were also experiencing, but it was doing it from the perspective of the true king. In the biblical framework, chaos isn't just a lack of organization. It's the whole idea of uncreation. We have a scientific term for this. It's entropy. In the Bible, chaos is the literal force of entropy that actively tries to dismantle the household God is building. When you see the word Leviathan in the Psalms or in Job, you probably think of a great sea beast, like a dragon that comes up out of the ocean, has wings and multiple heads and has fire-breathing nostrils. I mean, that's really literally the description of Leviathan in Psalms and Job. But in this case, I want you to think of a leader. I want you to think of the top brass of a growing rebellion against the order of the king. In fact, the end of Job 41 even calls him the king over the children of pride. So think of the personification in this case of chaos. He's the force that stood in the garden talking with Eve. He leads the rebel faction that wants the world to return to the state of formless and void. We're going to see a few more cases where he steps in to create chaos in a moment. Gunkel's work showed us that the biblical authors lived in a world where this war was common knowledge. They weren't speaking in flowery poetry. They were using the cultural and spiritual vocabulary of their day to describe a very real and catastrophic threat. This story is the sense maker, if you will, of the way our world feels like it's breaking down today. But to see it clearly, we have to understand the nature of the one who's trying to break it. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, we're given the coordinates of this great pre-creation state. The earth was tohu va bohu. You may have heard that before. It means formless and void, or unformed and empty. And it also says the darkness was over the face of the tehom, the deep. These aren't just fancy adjectives. They're signposts. We should pay attention to them. When God begins building his household, he doesn't just snap his fingers and make chaos disappear. He sets boundaries. He builds a bubble of order in the middle of a hostile environment. But if you look at the geography of the Promised Land, the ground zero of this story, you'll notice that God's people were literally surrounded by the rebellion. To the west, you have the Mediterranean. In the biblical mind, that's the Tehom, the deep. It's the source of watery chaos in our story. It's deep, it's unpredictable, and it's the place where Leviathan is said to come from. And then to the east, you have the great Arabian desert. That's the Tohu, the formless wilderness. It's the dry chaos, the wilderness where life goes to die. The household of Israel was positioned on a knife's edge between these two fronts. You shouldn't see this just as poetic placement either. It's a geographical reality. Living in the land meant living under the protection of the king, while the dry chaos of the desert to the east and the watery chaos of the deep to the west constantly pressed against the borders. This sets the stage for the entire biblical meta-narrative. History in this case is more than just a series of random events. It's a constant struggle to keep the household from being reclaimed by the wild. It's a battle to keep the water from flooding the basement and the sand from burying the roof. But as we're about to see, sometimes the rot in the house gets so bad that the king has to step back and let the chaos have its way for a season. The flood of Genesis is usually told as a morality tale about a guy with a boat, or maybe a story of the first apocalypse. But if we're looking at it a little more closely, a little more carefully, it's actually a total clearing of the building site. By Genesis 6, the household had become compromised. The rebellion had escaped the garden. It had breached the walls. The sons of God, the rebel faction of the heavenly council, had staged an incursion into the human line. The result? It was rotten to the core. The structure was so unstable that it threatened to collapse the entire human project. The architect of the household did something radical. He hit the reset button. Genesis 7, verse 11 says, "The fountains of the great Tehom, the deep, burst open." This is the watery chaos I talked about a minute ago. We study this like it was a bizarre weather event, but it was a whole lot more than that. It was God intentionally uncorking the deep. He allowed the very thing he'd pushed back in Genesis 1 to come rushing back in. He let the chaos of the rebellion devour itself. When the waters finally retreated, Noah and his family stepped off of the ark to find a cleared foundation, ready for the architect to start over on a clean site. But the problem with clearing a site is that unless you change the nature of the inhabitants, the same shadows eventually find their way back into the corners again. And as soon as the ground dried, a different kind of chaos started to blow in from the east. After the flood, the ground was dry, but the heart of the rebellion hadn't changed. The survivors moved east, right back into the tohu, the wilderness. In the plains of Shinar, they tried to build something the architect hadn't authorized. They wanted a global household of their own that functioned completely outside of the king's order. They wanted to make a name for themselves. They called it Babel. If the flood was watery chaos, then Babel was dry chaos. They thought they were building a monument to human stability, but they were actually inviting the wilderness into the heart of their home. This was the rebellion's attempt to establish a stronghold in the land. The prophet Isaiah looked back at this spirit hundreds of years later in Isaiah 24. He calls it the city of Tohu, the city of chaos, the city of the wilderness. It's the exact same word used for the unformed wasteland in Genesis. Trying to build their own household on their own terms, they'd essentially welcomed the wilderness back into the center of human civilization. The king didn't stop them with a lightning bolt this time. He used the very thing they were flirting with: confusion. He hit the accelerator on the chaos they'd already invited. He fractured their communication, effectively uncorking the dry chaos of the wilderness in their minds, and the project collapsed. Babel is the evidence that you can't build a stable house on a foundation of rebellion. When you try to exclude the architect and build your own house your own way, the chaos eventually finds its way in. The desert swallowed the tower and the people were scattered. But the rebellion didn't die. It moved from the open plains into the high security halls of the world's rising empires. And that takes us to the next place we see God use chaos like a weapon against itself: the long, dark night of Egypt. Properly understanding the Exodus means understanding Egyptian theology first. Their world was built on the idea that every night, the sun god, Ra, had to travel through the underworld and fight a massive chaos serpent named Apep. If Ra failed, the sun wouldn't rise, and the world would return to the deep. In the ninth plague, God didn't just turn off the lights. He staged a theological strike against the very core of Egypt's sense of stability and security. The Bible says a darkness fell that was so thick it could be felt. For 3 days, the sun stayed down. In the theology of that moment, God was benching Ra. He was holding the sun god back and letting the serpent Apep, their chaos monster, hold the territory. Think about the psychological impact for a moment. Egypt had built their entire civilization on their ability to beckon the gods and keep chaos at bay. But the architect of the true household showed them that the gods weren't even second-string players in this war. He uncorked the dark chaos, and let it rain just long enough to prove a point. If God doesn't hold the door, the shadows will walk right in. While Egypt sat in a darkness ruled by the serpent, the people of Israel had light in their dwellings. They were already living in the new bubble of order that would eventually lead them back to the promised land. Which brings us to a man named Job, in a conversation that changed everything we know about the dragon's leash. Most people read the book of Job as a debate about why bad things happen to good people. But if you look at the final act, it's not a debate at all. It's a correction of a flawed worldview. Job's life had been completely reclaimed by the wilderness. His wealth, his family, and his health, the order of his personal household, had been stripped away by a series of catastrophic events. He wanted a day in court. He wanted the architect to explain why the chaos had prevailed. But when God finally speaks from the whirlwind, he hands Job a dossier of the most dangerous operative in the rebellion, Leviathan. In Job 41, God asks a series of rhetorical questions. He asks things like, can you pull in Leviathan with a fish hook? Can you put a cord through his nose? The point God is making here isn't just about size or strength of this creature. It's about order and containment. He's showing Job that the world is a combat zone and Leviathan is a force that no human can tame, trap, or negotiate with, not even Job. If you've ever wondered why God's response feels so cold, you're missing the point of the passage entirely. God isn't showing Job the leash. He's proving that while the dragon is real, and while he's terrifyingly powerful, he's still within the architect's control. Think about it. God is the only one who can play with Leviathan in that passage. He's the only one who can put a hook in his jaw. By describing the dragon in such vivid detail, God's telling Job that his suffering isn't a sign that the architect has lost control of the house. It's a sign that Job is living in a world where a real rebellion is happening. When Job finally gets his household back, double what he had before. It's the evidence that the king is still the one who brings order. He's allowed the chaos to reign for a season to prove a point, not just to Job, but to the entire rebel council watching the whole thing unfold. But Leviathan doesn't stay in the book of Job. He moves. He changes shape. And that takes us to the prophetic words of Isaiah, where the dragon takes the crown of the human empires. By the time we get to the prophets, the rebellion has updated its tactics. It isn't just lurking in the deep or drifting through the wilderness anymore. It's wearing a crown. It's leading armies itself. It's established a permanent residence in the high security halls of the world's rising superpowers. In Isaiah 27, verse 1, the prophet files a specific intelligence update. He speaks of a day when the king will punish Leviathan the fleeing serpent and Leviathan the twisting serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. On the surface, it looks like more poetic imagery. But if you look at the mapping, it's a perfect match for the geopolitical threats facing God's household at the time. The fleeing and twisting serpent, that's Babylon. It's the power seated between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, a civilization born from dry chaos of the east. The dragon of the sea, it's Egypt. It's the superpower of the Nile Delta, the watery chaos that had already tried to drown the household once before. This is why the biblical authors are so obsessed with these specific nations. They're more than just historical neighbors. They're the proxies of the dragon. To fight the empire was to fight the serpent. But as history drags on, it becomes clear that human kings can't kill a dragon. You can't stop a cosmic insurgency with a bronze sword or a better tax code. And despite every promise from every politician since governments began, the rot in the house is too deep, and the enemies at the gate are too ancient. The household needed a different kind of operative. It needed someone who could walk directly into the wilderness and dive straight into the deep without drowning. And that takes us to the front lines of the first century, and a man walking into the desert to pick a fight. When Jesus of Nazareth arrives on the scene, his first move is a direct shot across the bow of the rebel leader. Immediately after his baptism, Jesus walks into the tohu, the wilderness, the dry chaos. For 40 days, he sits in the exact environment where chaos rules, facing the leader of the rebellion himself head on. Israel had spent 40 years in that same wilderness, a generation that struggled to maintain the king's order under the relentless pressure of that dry chaos. But Jesus holds the line. He proves that the order he carries is stronger than the entropy of the desert. But he doesn't just stop with the tohu, the wilderness. He goes for the tehom, the deep, as well. Think about the time Jesus is on a boat in the middle of a storm. The disciples are terrified because they're looking at the chaos of the sea, but Jesus is looking at the rebellion. When he rebukes the wind and the waves, he's using the same technical language used to cast out demons. He isn't just the Lord of the storm, he's the subduer of chaos itself. When he walks on the water, he's literally treading on the head of the deep. In the cultural language of the ancient Near East, walking on the sea was the ultimate sign of victory over Leviathan. It was the king demonstrating that the watery chaos has no authority in his presence. Jesus is the architect's son, the heir, coming to clean the house. Everywhere he goes, whether it's the wilderness or the sea, the chaos retreats. He's clearing the rooms one by one, showing that the insurgency has finally met its match. But clearing the rooms is only part of the mission. The rebellion still has its stronghold. And to finish the home, the dragon has to be flushed out once and for all. The climax of the entire conflict is the cosmic invasion in Revelation 12, where the dragon, it's explicitly identified as Satan, the ancient serpent, the deceiver of the whole world, is finally exposed and cast out of the heavenly realm. This is the announcement that his access to the king's court among the host of heaven is permanently revoked, confining his desperate rampage and remaining strategy to the human household on earth. The ultimate security of the restored household is signaled by Revelation 21, verse 1. And there was no more sea, it says. Reading with eyes to see, you'll notice that this is not talking about H2O, but the final end of the rebellion. The sea, Tehom, the ancient symbol of watery chaos, the source of unpredictability, and the dragon's dwelling, is permanently dried up. The architect ensures the permanent containment of the chaos, so the Father can complete the household in unshakable shalom, where the boundaries are forever secured. So, back to the question we started with. Was Leviathan real, or is he still real today? My final answer is yes. He was a real creature in prehistory. Metaphors are built on reality, usually, not on myths. Is he still a creature roaming the world today, in the sea, in the deep? I don't know about that. But I will say this. The biblical authors weren't scared of a big sea snake. They were documenting an actual enemy that still prowls the borders of our lives today. The chaos we see in the news and the collapse of global order in our personal lives, it's the active fingerprint of this ancient rebellion. What we're seeing today is the death throes of a creature long since destined for destruction. Whether he was physical or metaphysical, his impact is still very real. So when you find the chaos creeping into your own life, seek the only one who can provide true victory, true peace, and absolute order. Seek Jesus.
So I thought that video was very well done. I mean, it definitely shows how he is making those biblical correlations that ring true, especially when it comes to Tehom, the deep, and Tahu, the desert, and how he beautifully tied it in to Yahusha conquering both the deep and the desert. He is the answer to chaos. Now, in our next video by Scott, he will show additional biblical correlations, but this time it will be in correlation to demonic spirits. And these correlations will also ring true. So once again, we have come across a topic, like I mentioned earlier, that in the past has not been rightly divided. And these sessions we are looking at are meant to help us open our understanding about the unseen realm. And, that's why these metaphors were used for us to grasp in our three-dimensional reality what his word has been telling us. And then Yahusha provides different people in the body to help explain these topics more clearly. So praise Yah for that. I pray these clips have been a blessing to all of you. And we too play a large role in this unseen realm. May we ask Yahweh to give us eyes to see and blood-tipped ears to hear and understand. We are his royal kingly ambassadors. And just like his angelic hosts have duties, so do we. The greatest hindrance, however, is not to believe in the existence of the unseen realm, which consists of both good and evil. If we do not believe this, if we do not know the characteristics of such, how will we ever recognize when a demonic spirit is speaking directly to us through the flesh of man or in other diverse ways? If one says, well, I've never encountered such, I mean, we would have to ponder if they were either oblivious or naive. Through many church years that I've experienced, through fellowships, Bible studies, I've seen several manifestations that ebb and flow. What triumphs is Yahweh's word of truth. But none of such occurrences have come and gone without agitation, a disturbance of some sort before and after. Such battles are not for the weak-hearted that cannot stand nor even perceive what has taken place. Many times you'll see some side with the adversarial spirit and join their ranks. And don't we see that very much today in some of the behavior we see in the man-made religions of today? Many of them that call themselves believers may one day turn against true believers because they have been deceived and they believe the lies of the adversarial spirit that has flipped the script, right? It's confused people. By now, we should be grasping the various sources of chaos of Tehom, the deep, and Tohu, the desert. And we must keep our feet firmly planted on the foundation of Jesus of Nazareth, that is master of all. So this is the picture he has painted. This is the cosmic spiritual war that has been going on from day one. And this is how he chose to articulate it and teach us. And it takes time and energy and study to see and make all these biblical correlations that ring true. So as we get into this next clip about the demonic spirits, we're going to see several distinctions. And he goes over this in the video, but I want to emphasize this because just like that past video, it was very, very good. But sometimes you have to listen to it more than one time, right? To really grasp the concepts that have been beautifully painted for us. So there are distinctions within the categories of demons. There are distinctions between the categories of demonic spirits. For instance, when the disciples failed to cast out a demon, Jesus said this spirit can only be cast out through prayer and fasting. See, there was a distinction with that demonic spirit. So not all demonic encounters are the same. Not all of them yield the same approach. The framework has internal complexities. And next, demons consistently identify Jesus of Nazareth correctly before his own disciples do. They consistently fear judgment. So they knew who he was before his disciples even knew who he was, and they consistently fear judgment. They know the power of Yahushua HaMashiach, Jesus of Nazareth. Next, negotiate. Demonic spirits consistently negotiate around their appointed fate rather than simply submitting to it. They seek embodiment. So this, again, is a correlation about demonic spirits that ring true. timeline. The demonic spirits know their timeline. Legal awareness. Demonic spirits operate with a legal awareness of what they are and are not permitted to do. They know their boundaries. They know their boundaries, and Yahweh has given all of us our boundaries. None of those correlating behaviors make sense if demons are just fallen angels doing vague spiritual mischief. And he'll get into that further in the video. All of it makes perfect sense if they are what the Second Temple tradition said they were. You know, that was the time during when Yahusha came the first time. They are displaced spirits of dead hybrid beings operating in a world where the one person who has authority to end their current existence has just walked into it. So you see how this increase in agitation happens when Yahusha appears, not only in the first coming, but will yet happen again with his second coming. In other words, all the ants, quote unquote, recognize the power and the arrival of the branch. So these demonic spirits are displaced spirits looking for embodiment, and they come from the hybrid beings, the Nephilim that died. Okay? So let's take a listen.
Have you ever noticed that there are no demons in the Old Testament? Well, not at least how they show up in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, you get the snake in the garden and the sons of God in Genesis 6. You also get a handful of Hebrew words that scholars argue about, words like Shadim and Azazel and Seirim, but nothing that looks like what you see in the Gospels. There's no possessions and no exorcisms, no beings who speak and negotiate and beg and identify Jesus by name before his own disciples fully understand who he is. The Old Testament seems almost one-dimensional. There's God and there's humans, and there's a few angels, but it seems like there's not much else. Then the Gospels open, and the spirit world is suddenly everywhere. From the first chapter of Mark, every step Jesus takes into public life draws a response from the spirit world. They're living inside people and screaming in synagogues and driving a man to mutilate himself in a graveyard. They know who Jesus is, and they're terrified of what his arrival means. And then the disciples start casting them out, and Paul writes letters to churches about principalities and powers and rulers of darkness operating over entire regions. The whole landscape of the New Testament assumes a detailed, functional demonology that the Old Testament seems to barely hint at. That gap has been a source of confusion for a lot of people who don't really understand the difference in spirituality, and specifically demonic activity, between the Old and the New Testaments. So where does that difference come from between the two testaments? Well, the skeptic says that it's just a literary invention. The Jewish writers in the New Testament picked up ideas from the Babylonian exile and from Persian dualism and from the Hellenistic world. And by the first century, those ideas had worked their way into popular religion. They say that what you're reading in the Gospels isn't actually revelation. It's a cultural accumulation. To them, that means demons aren't real beings with coherent original story. They're mythology that the New Testament writers inherited and they didn't bother to correct. That answer is simple and it sounds sophisticated from an academic perspective, but it doesn't actually hold up to the test of the text itself. On the other hand, the believer's standard isn't much better either. They usually point to fallen angels. They say that Satan rebelled and took a third of the angels with him, which is true. And those fallen angels are what we call demons, which is where it begins to be a little bit of a stretch. It is tidy, and it's been taught in Sunday school for generations. But the problem is that it doesn't explain anything the New Testament actually is showing you. It doesn't answer questions like, why do demons seek bodies? We know that fallen angels don't need bodies. They are already spirit beings, and they've shown that they have the ability to manifest themselves in physical form in the Old Testament. Why do they roam dry places as if they're going mad? Why do they beg not to be sent to the abyss before their time or out of the country where they're dwelling? Why does Legion, an entire army of them, negotiate with Jesus about where they're allowed to go? If demons are just fallen angels, none of that behavior makes sense. Both answers, the secular academic and the traditional Christian answer, fail when they're lined up against the text. One of them dismisses it as myth, and the other flattens it into a comfortable category that doesn't fit the text. So here's what I'm going to do with this video. I'm going to show you that the Bible actually has a coherent, traceable demonology rooted in the Hebrew text itself, and it's not imported from outside cultures. I'll show you that there's not one, but three distinct categories of hostile spiritual beings, each with a different origin and a different current status and a different appointed fate. And I'll show you that the explosion of demonic confrontation in the Gospels isn't random, and it's not just the result of people suddenly paying closer attention. It's the expected result of what Jesus came to do. His mission goes to the nations, and the nations are occupied territory. There are powers that have held that ground for a long time, and they know exactly what his arrival means for them. Before we get too deep into this video about demonology in the Old Testament and the New Testament, I have to tell you that I just released a book. So if you're into biblical history or biblical archaeology, I encourage you to check it out. It's Dynasty of Slaves. And I finally have an actual copy to show you instead of putting a picture on the screen. I've been talking about it for a while. If you already have it, thank you so much for picking it up. Go ahead and do your best to remember to go back and leave a review. That's really helpful for me. If you haven't picked it up, go search Dynasty of Slaves on Amazon or just click the link in the description under the video. I think you'll like it. It's the uncovering of archaeological evidence for Israel in Egypt. So I walk through from Genesis 12 all the way through the Exodus, showing where there's evidence of Israel in Egypt during that period. Go ahead and check it out. Back to our study on demonology between the Old Testament and the New Testament, we need to start with the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, because what we find there, what happens in that period, shapes everything about how we understand the New Testament writers. Most Christians treat the intertestamental period like a silent waiting period. Nothing canonical is being written, so nothing important is happening. I think that's a pretty big mistake. The Jewish people during this period are not sitting still theologically. They're reading their own scriptures with intense focus. They're wrestling with questions the text raises but doesn't always fully answer. There are questions about the spirit world and about what happened in Genesis 6, about the origin of evil, the nature of hostile spiritual beings, and what God intends to do about all of it. And out of that wrestling comes a body of literature that becomes the shared cosmological vocabulary of first century Judaism. It's the water they swim in, you could think of. The most important piece of that literature for our purposes is First Enoch, specifically the sections known as the Book of Watchers. I'm not saying that's the most important book of that period. I'm just saying for our conversation today. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Enoch isn't in my Bible. And you're right, it probably isn't unless you have an Ethiopian Bible. But multiple copies of First Enoch were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which means it wasn't a fringe text sitting on the margins of Jewish thought. It was being copied and studied and circulated by people who study their scriptures and take them seriously. And the New Testament itself treats it as authoritative tradition, even if it doesn't necessarily canonize it. Jude quotes it directly, not just an allusion, not just a reference. It's an actual quote. That alone is enough reason to understand that it's an important book to the apostles. What it says is that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were watchers, divine beings who crossed the boundary between heavenly and earthly realms. They took human women and produced offspring called the Nephilim. And that those Nephilim, when they died, left something behind. They are disembodied spirits, beings that were part divine and part human with no proper place in either realm and no body to inhabit. So they're wandering and they're seeking. We even see some of this language when Jesus speaks. By the time Jesus arrives, this is widely assumed background. It's what educated Jews believed when they heard the word demon. It's what the disciples understood, and it's what the crowds understood. Jesus never stops to explain the demonology because it doesn't need to. His audience already has this framework in their mind during his sermons. The Gospels are written for people who already know this. We're reading them from the outside looking in, and most of us have never been handed the key that the first century Jews had. So let's take a second to build that framework. Let's see if we can find that key. There are 3 tiers, 3 origins, 3 current statuses, and 3 fates. Once you see these 3 clearly, the New Testament snaps into focus, or at least the demonology of the New Testament does. Tier 1, we're going to look at the Watchers. We're going to start with Genesis 6. This is a summary of what happens there. The sons of God see the daughters of men, they take them as wives, and the Nephilim are born. If you've watched the Seed War video that I did a couple of months ago, you know the full picture. So if you're confused, I'd say maybe pause here, go back and watch that video, and then come back here. For our purposes in this moment, what matters is what happens immediately after that. The watchers who cross that boundary are imprisoned. They're not destroyed and they're not roaming the earth. They're imprisoned in a specific place. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 says that God spared not the angels that sinned, but he cast them down to Tartarus and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved unto judgment. Jude 6 says, the angels which kept not their first estate, but left their own habitation, are reserved in everlasting change under darkness unto the judgment of the great day. This is specifically the ones who willfully left heaven to come to earth for some specific purpose. These are not the angels who are cast out of heaven. That's very important to understand the difference between those things. These beings are not active, though. They are bound and waiting a verdict that has already been pronounced, but is not yet fully executed. Their imprisonment is the direct consequence of Genesis 6. It's permanent until the judgment day. And then you have tier 2, the Nephilim spirits. The Nephilim are the offspring of those unions in Genesis 6. They're hybrid beings. You'd say they were part divine or part spirit and part human. They live, they die in the flood and later in the conquest. And when they die, something happens that doesn't happen when ordinary humans die. Their spirits are not at rest. The Book of Watchers is explicit about this. Because they're not fully human, their spirits do not go where human spirits go. They're displaced. They're disembodied. They wander. They seek embodiment because embodiment is the only existence they've ever known. This is why demons in the Gospels seek bodies. This is why they roam to dry places, as Jesus says. This is why Legion negotiates about where they're allowed to go rather than simply leaving. These aren't angel-class beings operating in their native mode. We would say that angel-class beings operating in their native mode are not subject to regions. These are spirits of dead hybrid beings doing exactly what the Second Temple tradition said they would do. The Rephaim pipeline connects here. That word in Hebrew carries two distinct usages that most English readers never see. It refers to a specific population of giant clans in Canaan, and it refers to the shades of the dead in Sheol. Isaiah 14, Psalm 88, Proverbs 9. The overlap is not accidental in these situations. It's the same category of being before and after death. If you want the full treatment of that thread, the Rephaim video covers it in detail back from December, one of my older videos. Then there's tier 3, the Deuteronomy 32 princes. This tier is different, and the difference here matters. There's confusion about the difference between the Nephilim and the princes of Deuteronomy 32, and so I want to take a moment to talk about that. We're going to go to Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. When the Most High divided the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. But the Dead Sea Scrolls text say something different. It also echoes the Septuagint. They both read the sons of God there rather than the children of Israel. And that reading explains everything that follows in the biblical narrative about the gods of the nations. At Babel, God allotted the nations to the divine beings. Those beings were given jurisdiction, and Psalm 82 tells you what they did with it. They judged unjustly, it says. They accepted the worship that belonged to God alone. And in Psalm 82, it pronounces their sentence. It says, "Nevertheless, ye shall die like men, and fall like one of the princes." These beings are not bound. They are currently active. They are the principalities and the powers that Paul writes about in Ephesians chapter 6. They are the rulers of this age. Their sin is different from the Watchers. Their timeline is different. They weren't imprisoned after Genesis 6 because their offense came later, and their role in the allotment structure was part of God's own design, even if they corrupted it. Satan sits across all three tiers as a distinct figure. This Satan figure, not the general adversary, but Satan himself, the serpent, the deceiver. Still with access, as Job 1 and 2 show us clearly, still the accuser, condemned but not yet confined. Revelation 12 tells you his time is short and he knows it. I did a video about that right before Christmas in December 2025, so if you're curious about what Revelation 12 says about Satan, go check out that video and then come back here. He's not a fallen watcher. He's not a Nephilim spirit. He is the adversary, operating in a legal capacity that hasn't fully closed yet. So there it is, 3 tiers, 3 origins, 3 current statuses, and 3 different fates. Well, they all end up in the same place, but they get there different ways. The conflation of all 3 into one bucket by labeling them as fallen angels has cost the church an enormous amount of clarity about what the New Testament is actually describing when it comes to demonology. Now go back to the Gospels and read them with everything that we've just built underneath it. If you've watched my video on Mark chapter 5 about the cosmological map, then you have a better picture of what's going on here. In Mark 5, there is Legion, the Abyss, the Swine, the Decapolis. Now, I'm not going to repeat all of that. What we are going to do is look at the pattern across multiple encounters, because the pattern is what proves the framework isn't being retrofitted into one convenient story. It's a framework that runs through all of them. We're going to start with Mark chapter 1, all the way at the beginning, the first chapter written about Jesus. Jesus walks into the synagogue at Capernaum, and immediately a man with an unclean spirit cries out. And what does that spirit say? It says, "Let us alone. What have we to do with thee, thou Jesus of Nazareth? Art thou come to destroy us? I know thee who thou art, the Holy One of God." This is the first public act of Jesus' ministry, not a sermon, not a healing. It's an immediate confrontation with a being that recognizes him on sight, and he knows exactly what his presence means. The Spirit doesn't ask who Jesus is because it already knows. It's the same thing that happens in Mark chapter 5, just a few chapters later. What it wants to know is whether destruction is happening now or at some other time. That's not the behavior of a fallen angel operating in its native spiritual mode. That's a behavior of a displaced being with eschatological awareness, a being that knows the timeline and is terrified that its appointed moment has actually arrived ahead of schedule. Matthew 12 gives you the mute and blind demoniac. And what matters here isn't just the exorcism, it's what Jesus says immediately after it. He goes straight into the strong man, saying, "How can one enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods except the first bind the strong man?" Jesus isn't stopping to give us a parable. He's not speaking abstractly or using allegory. He's describing what his mission is doing in real time. Every demon cast out is evidence the strong man is being bound, that enemy-held territory is being reclaimed. Mark 7 takes Jesus into Syrophoenician territory, Gentile ground, and a woman comes to him about her daughter who has an unclean spirit. Now pay attention to where you are on the map. This is Deuteronomy 32 geography, current-day Lebanon. This is allotted territory to the enemy, to the nations. The confrontation isn't incidental to the location, though. Jesus is operating in the jurisdiction of the Deuteronomy 32 princes, and his presence there is itself the confrontation. The daughter is freed from a distance. Jesus never has to look at her to set her free from the demon, and I think that's worth paying attention to. The power operating in that territory has no ability to resist him even when he isn't physically present in the room. And then on to Mark chapter 9, it gives you the boy with the convulsing spirit. And this one is notable for a different reason. The disciples couldn't cast it out themselves. Jesus casts it out and then tells them afterward that this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting. There are distinctions within the category. Not all demonic encounters are the same. Not all of them yield the same approach. The framework has internal complexity, even though it looks like it's simple from the outside, and the text is not trying to flatten it. Now look at the pattern across all of those stories. Demons consistently identify Jesus correctly before his own disciples do. They consistently fear judgment. They consistently negotiate around their appointed fate rather than simply submitting to it. They seek embodiment. They know the timeline. They operate with a legal awareness of what they are and are not permitted to do. None of that behavior makes sense if demons are just fallen angels doing vague spiritual mischief. All of it makes perfect sense if they are what the Second Temple tradition said they were. Displaced spirits of dead hybrid beings operating in a world where the one person who has authority to end their current existence has just walked into it. They knew what his arrival meant before almost anyone else did. And that recognition, that sense of terror and fear in their voice when talking to Jesus, is woven through every encounter from the first chapter of Mark to the last exorcism in the Gospels. Now, everything that I've just walked through in the Gospels, Paul is applying to the present mission of the church in his letters. Some people think that Paul was developing a new theology of the spirit world in his epistles, but that's not what he's doing at all. He's working from the same framework that Jesus is operating in and drawing out its implications for churches planted in Gentile territory. He's taking Jesus' unique mission to Israel and translating it for his own mission to the nations. Deuteronomy 32 territory, that's where Paul was sent. Enemy held ground. Ephesians 6:12 says, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness in this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." That list is the reality that we face. It's principalities and powers in the technical vocabulary. It's the context of Deuteronomy 32 allotment structure. These are the beings who have held jurisdiction over the nations since Babel. Paul is telling churches in the middle of that territory that the opposition they're facing has a real, structured, hierarchical source, and that they need to understand what they're up against. Colossians chapter 2, verse 15 says, "Having spoiled principalities and powers, he made a show of them openly, triumphing over them in it." The cross was about human sin, but it was more than just that. It publicly humiliated the powers that had held the nations in bondage. The word Paul uses for triumphing is the language of a Roman military procession, a conqueror parading his defeated enemies through the streets. That's what the cross did to the principalities. Their authority was stripped, their claim was broken. They're still operating, but they're operating as a defeated army that hasn't fully vacated the field yet. 1 Corinthians 2, verse 8 tells us something remarkable about how that defeat happened. None of the princes of this world knew what the cross would accomplish. Had they known, Paul says, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. They engineered their own defeat in a way. They thought their crucifixion was their victory, and it was the instrument of their undoing. 1 Corinthians 10:20 closes the loop on the Deuteronomy 32 structure directly. The things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. The gods behind the idols are real beings. They're not figments of imagination. The worship is real worship being directed to real entities. He's telling the Corinthian church that the religious landscape of the Gentile world is the Deuteronomy 32 allotment structure still operating, and that participating in it is a live spiritual danger. Paul is applying a coherent, inherited framework to the present reality of churches living and witnessing in the middle of territory that has been under hostile jurisdiction since Babel. And the cross is the event that changed the legal status of that jurisdiction permanently, even if the full eviction is still in the future. All three tiers are defeated at the cross, none of them fully removed yet. And that tension is not a problem with the framework. The strong man is bound, the house is being plundered, but the final removal is still future. And the church is the instrument of that plundering, carrying the gospel into territory that has been under hostile jurisdiction since Babel, doing exactly what Jesus was doing in Decapolis, in Syrophoenician territory, in every Gentile region he walked into deliberately. Now, as a pastor, here's what I want you to understand from this story. It's not just academic. It's not just theoretical. The greatest tactical advantage of a real enemy is convincing you that he doesn't exist. A defeated army that can make you forget it's an army operates with an effectiveness completely disproportionate to its actual remaining power. The Western church has largely handed that advantage over freely. We have spiritualized the language of Ephesians 6 into a metaphor. We've reduced its principalities and powers to vague cultural forces, and we treated the demonic possession as a first century phenomenon that modernity has moved beyond. And in doing so, we have gone into genuinely contested territory without a map, without situational awareness, and without taking seriously what Paul told those churches in Ephesus and Corinth about what they were actually dealing with. But here is what is also true. You are not fighting for a victory that hasn't happened yet. The strong man is already bound. The principalities are already disarmed and publicly humiliated. Every hostile being you ever encounter operates under a judgment that was declared before you were born and will be executed on a timetable that is not theirs to control. The outcome has never been in doubt. In other words, you're not fighting for victory, you're fighting from victory. Let me give you a quick homework assignment from a pastor. Go read Mark 5 and Ephesians 6 this week. Read them with everything that you now know underneath them. I would bet you that you're not going to read it the same way again.
All right. Again, that was packed with information and also things that we could really share and enhance with the knowledge that we have received thus far with our studies. And one big part of that was when we went through the Fragmented Soul series and realized that we are all fragmented somewhat. Maybe we have a couple of fragments in our soul, our broken heartedness, if you will, or maybe there's extreme cases of fragmentation. And in that series, we learned how demonic spirits can influence those harmed and damaged parts of our soul because those parts of our soul are vulnerable. And that's what demonic spirits do. They look for weaknesses so they can attack a person in that area. We also learned in the Fragmented Soul that, and we have to remember this too in the Gospels, that Yahusha, he healed those that were dealing with demonic spirits. And other times he delivered them. And other times he healed and delivered them. Not everyone that's being oppressed by a demonic spirit or influenced by a demonic spirit, maybe one part of their fragmented soul being influenced by a demonic spirit, that doesn't mean that their core, their inner core, is not saved. And I believe that's where a lot of people get confused when we see people with struggles. Many people are broken, they're fragmented. The body of Israel, the one new man, is it not fragmented? And it's only Yahushua, Jesus of Nazareth, that can heal the brokenhearted individually and also bring together in the end of time Israel that has been scattered abroad. Just like the manna that was gathered in the wilderness, they went out and they had to gather the manna and they made them into cakes and they molded them and shaped them. You know, those are pictures of what a fragmented individual or the fragmented one new man written about in the Bible is all about. And only Jesus of Nazareth, Yahushua, can heal the fragmented soul and the fragmented one new man. And that's what we wait for. So I just wanted to touch base on that because that was a very good series we went through and really gave us a lot of understanding that we never had before, because some people are going through deliverance when actually all they need is healing. And some people need healing and deliverance. They actually have a fragmented soul in such bad shape that they are dealing with a possession type deal. So all of that can get pretty deep. But we did go through that series. We did glean more. We do understand more. Not that we are completely knowledgeable of that, but we've been exposed to it. And that helps us understand those around us. The other thing that was very interesting in this clip that I didn't get before, maybe y'all did, was when he talked about watchers, that they were those that chose to leave their heavenly estate, but they are not, this is the part I didn't get, they are not to be confused with those cast out in Revelation 12:4. I thought that was a good point. The other thing, he talked about the Rephaim, and in our next session, we'll listen to that clip because, you know, many of these videos kind of tie together. And it's fantastic he can keep them short because I know he could go on and on if he wanted to. The other thing he made very clear was that these demonic spirits exist, these little g gods exist, and we don't want to worship them. But here again, that's where our knowledge of his feast days are so important, and how believers today are still being gathered together. That fragmented understanding of his word hopefully is being revealed more and more, and hopefully believers are shifting from cultural holidays to his feast days that worship him and him only, and not little g gods. So like many today, at one point we were confused on that and we fell into cultural holidays. But if anyone understands the chaos that we face and struggle with on both sides, it's Yahushua HaMashiach, Jesus of Nazareth. So I ran across a few shorts, and this is what the world is really focused on these days, what others are asking this technology of today.
You gotta watch this.
I asked ChatGPT, if you were the devil, and maybe you are, if you were the devil, what would you do? And the answer that came back at me shook me in my shoes. I wouldn't waste my time trying to get you to worship me. No, I just convince you not to worship God at all. I'd tell you truth is relative. Your truth, my truth, until nobody knows which way is up. I'd whisper, as long as you're happy, it's right. I'd keep you busy. Too busy for prayer, too busy for church, too busy for crew. I'll put that one in. Too busy to ask eternal questions. I'd fill your hands with a phone so you'd never have time to fold them in prayer. I'd break families, get fathers absent, marriages bitter, and kids confused. If I can fracture the home, I can fracture the future. I'd divide the church, petty arguments, comparison, offense, celebrity culture. If I can get Christians fighting each other, they'll never fight me. I'd desensitize you. I'd glamorize sin in movies, normalize it in music, laugh at it in comedy, and celebrate it in culture until what once shocked you now entertains you. I'd attack your identity. I'd make you question who you are, where you belong, and whether you matter. I'd whisper shame so loud you can't hear God's voice of love. And through it all, I wouldn't even try to prove I exist. My greatest trick is to convince you I'm not real. Because if you don't believe I'm real, you'll never resist.
Very true, very telling. And here's a mom asking a similar question.
ChatGPT, if you were the devil, how would you destroy the young minds of the next generation without them even knowing it?
If I were the devil, I wouldn't come with violence. I'd come with convenience. I'd give them everything they wanted and strip them of everything they needed. I'd make them feel connected, but completely alone, endlessly entertained, but quietly empty. I'd blur the lines between truth and opinion until nothing meant anything. I'd teach them to chase dopamine, not purpose, to worship self, but loathe who they are. I wouldn't destroy them with war. I'd destroy them with apathy. I'd keep them distracted, numb, scrolling, always scrolling. I'd dismantle the family by redefining it. Make fathers optional, mothers exhausted, and children confused. I'd hand them a phone before they could speak in full sentences. And I'd watch their minds rot slowly, sweetly, silently. And the most brilliant part? They'd never know it was me. They'd call it freedom.
So that's what today's reality is. The devil is after the souls of children after the souls of mankind. And we know, believers, we are the temple. And the chaos is out there. The chaos of to home and the chaos of to who? The waters and the deep. Leviathan and behemoth. Temptations left and right. And we're walking on that narrow path that leads to life. So praise Yah, we do live with the victory that Yahushua HaMashiach has achieved for us. We find our rest in Him from that chaos. Whatever we struggle with, we find that rest in Him. Whatever fragmented part of our soul cries out to us, even from those fragments from childhood, or fragments maybe very recently from broken relationships, or trouble at work, or trouble with family issues. Whatever chaos in this fallen world we deal with, He is our strength. And we have that strength from His victory. And we can go to Him with those things and ask Him for help, ask Him for healing, or even ask Him for deliverance. We can go to Him and rest in Him. He is our peace. He is our shalom. And when something disturbs your peace in Him, that should get your attention. Right then and there, that should get your attention. What did you just encounter? What made you feel that way? What upset your peace? and then let him reveal to you what it may have been and how to deal with it. Because he demonstrated that for us in the New Testament, did he not? Just like that video said, after he was baptized by John the Immerser, making that shift back to the Melchizedek priesthood, back to covenant Torah. He went into the Tohu, the wilderness, the dry place, and he was tempted. His shalom was affected. He went without food and water for 40 days, but turned to speaking the word. He used the word that is sharper than any two-edged sword to defeat the chaos. And again, Scott used that example of Tehom, the deep, the sea, the chaos of the sea, and how he showed us by him walking on water that all chaos is placed under his feet, under his command, and under his boundaries and authority. Therefore, we can rest in him. Thanks for joining us this week, and hopefully we'll gather again next Shabbat, and then we'll dig deeper.